Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Power of Trust with Sandra Sucher and Shalene Gupta. My name is Colin Main, and I'm a program manager at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. As you may have just seen in the chat, the NASDAQ Center, along with our partner Mentor Cloud, launched a free mentor matching platform for entrepreneurs called Mentor Makers. So find or become a mentor today by using the link in the chat. Quick housekeeping item, we're going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Now, none of what we do at the center could be possible without all the amazing support from its sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, BPM, and NZTE. We're humbled by their contributions. During these still somewhat unique times, the center is curious on how sentiment is among the entrepreneurs that we work with. So we're going to start by taking a quick poll on how you're doing right now. The first question we've been measuring since the beginning of 2020 when COVID-19 hit. And the second question helps guide us to what responsive programming we should be educating and providing for you, the entrepreneurs that we serve. So take a moment, fill out that poll, and we will get started just momentarily. Appreciate you guys giving some insights on this one. Looks like optimism is at the rise, but totally understand there's a little bit of anxiousness out there. And it looks like sales is at the top of our What's Keeping You Up at Night poll. So I'm going to end that poll, share those results. So 2021, looking a little bit better than 2020. So optimism is better, but totally understand some of you are anxious out there. And then sales. So thank you for providing those answers. Now, without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome in our chat to our host for this conversation. Shalene Gupta is a research associate at Harvard Business School, and she's joined by her co-author and author of The Power of Trust, Sandra Sucher. She's a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. Shalene, Sandra, so happy to have you, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your book.
Thank you so much, Colin. Sandra and I are so excited to be here, especially because this was completely unexpected. So I'm just going to start off with the story of how we came to be studying trust. So a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I decided that I was tired of corporate jobs. I just felt like injustices happened between closed doors. There was too much politics. I was like, I'm done. I'm going to become a starving novelist. It's going to be wonderful. The only problem with that is you do, in fact, become a starving novelist. So I had to get a job. And I ended up going to work for Sandra. And at the time, Sandra had two different streams of research. One was on layoffs, and the other was on moral leadership. And there was a lot in her work about best practices and what companies should be doing. And I just fell in love with it. And I remember thinking, wow, if companies did all of these best practices, I would still stay at corporations. I really loved working. I wanted to work. It was just a lot of the policies and hierarchies that seemed unfair drove me crazy. And so Sandra and I went to Japan to research a company that had an absolutely marvelous policy for how it treated its employees. It asked them from day one, why are you here? And then managers were tasked with the question of figuring out what their employees were passionate about and coming up with a task that tied to the company's bottom line so the employees could do what they're passionate about and also help the company gain revenue. And the whole time during that trip, I started thinking, why are we here? Why is Sandra here? And at that time, Sandra was working on a book on layoffs. And the last day of our trip, I turned to Sandra in the hotel and I said, are you sure you want to write a book on layoffs? I think there's a much better story here, one about trust and how companies can become trusted. And then I paused and then I realized, oh my God, I've been working for Sandra for 6 months. I am probably about to get fired. And I had deep regrets. And then Sandra turned to me and said, let's do it. I think that's a great idea. And that's how we started writing about trust. And it all began with a moment of trust between two people, because at that time I had built up enough trust in Sandra to realize, oh my gosh, she's somebody I can actually tell this to. And so thank you very much, Sandra, for listening to that initial crazy question and not firing me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love our origin story because it really taught us so much about trust. And it's very hard to move into this space. You know, you'll all be thinking this as entrepreneurs. If you're not sort of thinking about, well, what's a situation which I've had to trust someone else, right? And why would I do that? And what happened when I did? And so this situation between the two of us really taught me a lot about trust. And how it operates. And, you know, Shalene doesn't mention the fact that she's a past Fortune reporter, that she is a journalist and a novelist in her own right. And she was a Fulbright scholar. And so it's like she was smart, right? And a great person to work with. So it wasn't like I was making like a foolish bet. I was trusting her for something we'll talk about later, which is for her competence and for how well-intentioned she seemed to be. And also how fair she was. I mean, she didn't ask this question of me like with a lot of people looking on. It was like, you know, just the two of us in this big hotel lobby. And so no witnesses. And the impact was that she really helped me think about really quickly what it was that I wanted to focus on. And you know how important focus is in the lives that you lead. And so this was a huge moment to kind of go, wow, left turn here, let's go for it. But I would never have come to this if it hadn't been for Shalene.
There it is in action. Nobody listens the way Sandra does. And so actually, let's just take a step back. Sandra, speaking of trust, can you give us a concrete definition? Because we throw that word around a lot, but it becomes quite difficult to actually pin it down.
Yeah, so the story we just told is a great example. So trust is vulnerability, right? When we trust, we are vulnerable to another person's actions toward us, meaning would I fire Shalene, for example, after asking that question? Sorry. And also their intentions. So Shalene had to trust at that moment that I was well-intentioned toward her. And that I had her best interest at heart, and I did too. So trust is this relationship of vulnerability, where we're counting on people to do things we can't do for ourselves. I would never have asked that question if Shalene hadn't put the question to me. But because I'm vulnerable at that moment, that's why trust can be betrayed. It's not just like I'm disappointed. You know, if something goes south when I'm trusting, it's like, okay, I feel really lousy here. I've been betrayed. So trust is a relationship of vulnerability to other people's actions.
And why is that important for entrepreneurs? Why should we care about trust?
So the research on this is really helpful for entrepreneurs. So you all lead teams, right? And so there's this great study of 30 NCAA basketball teams. And what they looked at was what difference did it make if the teams had confidence and trust in their coach? And what they found in the study was that the teams that trusted their coaches won more of their games than the trust that didn't. In particular, the team that had the most trust in its coach won the most games and in fact won the championship. And the team with the lowest trust in their coach won just 10% of their games. So the first reason why it matters is that these teams that you're leading, they're going to really do better if they trust you. So that's point one. Point two is that you'll make more money. So there's this great study about Holiday Inns where the researchers were trying to figure out what impact did various managerial behaviors have on performance, in particular on revenues. And what they found was that an eighth of a point increase in a rating, which was on a 1 to 5 scale, in trust correlated to 2.5%, let me make that a number, $250,000 increase in revenue. And they found that no other element had as much of a focus on an impact on revenue as trust in the manager did. So point one, your teams are going to do better. Point two, you're going to make more money. And point three is you're actually going to live in a better place if your country is good at trust. And so the World Bank did a study of 29 different market economies. And what they found was that a 10% rise in trust correlated with nearly a 1% increase in GDP. Now, 1% increase in GDP is huge. And so trust has that scaling effect. in that it really affects the way that our economy works. So that's another reason to contribute to it if you're an entrepreneur.
So sounds like trust is extremely important, but whose job is it to implement it in an organization or in a small?
Yeah, so if I were you and listening, here's the sorry truth. You are really responsible for building an environment in which people trust your organization and you. Right. This is nobody else's job. You can't outsource this. You can't have a board member do this for you. You can't find a consultant who's going to do it for you. This is something that you actually have to manage.
And so speaking of managing this, if you're looking for a mentor then as an entrepreneur, what are your tips on how to find one, Sandra, and how to get a good mentor?
So I was thinking, because the people were nice enough to say, we're going to ask you a question about mentorship, which is really important for entrepreneurs. And so I have, just because I've been around for a long time, mentored a lot of people, students. My current mentee, who is my favorite, is my daughter-in-law. And my daughter-in-law is an entrepreneur in her own right. So I thought about the three things that she does that actually help me be glad to be her mentor. So the first thing that she does is that she's efficient. So she's very clear and specific in what her ask is. And usually the asks are pretty limited. A lot of times it's a Harvard Business School case that she's interested in, that she read about, and can I get her the case? The second is that she's really mindful of my schedule and my ability to respond. And so, she comes with a concrete request. She understands if I'm underwater and that I can't get to it right away. And the third thing that she's great about is that she's appreciative in the way she shows that as she tells me what happened. Because I read this case, here's what I picked up from that I actually wouldn't have thought of before. So I think, one of the tricks here is to be a really good mentee. And that there are some things you can do that really make your mentor glad to be someone who is mentoring you.
Wisdom of the ages right there from Sandra. So we know that leaders have to build trust and find a trusted mentor, but what do we look for when we decide whether or not to trust a company?
So I'm going to use Uber as an example. Just because it's, I think, easier to think about trust in a particular circumstance. And so one of the things that we know about trust is that it's not just one thing, right? So trust, as it turns out, trust in a company is multifaceted. And Shalene and I found in our research, there are 4 dimensions to it. The first is competence. Right, so no one is going to trust your business if you're not good at the thing that you say you're going to be good at. And Uber is unbelievably great at getting us from point A to point B. The reason why Uber owned nearly 90% of US ride hailing was because they built such an amazing series of systems to understand who we were, where we needed to go, how to create a payless ride for us, how to track what it is that we're doing. So they were unbelievably competent. But I don't know about you, I myself have kind of second thoughts about how much of my business I'm going to give to Uber. And that's because trust is more than just competence. If trust were competence alone, we'd all be in Uber really happily. But there are some things that we know about how Uber has operated in the past that makes it hard for us to trust them fully. So the first thing is, there's this question of motives. So we care about your competence, and then we really care about who it is, whose interest you serve. So there's an amazing, awful story about Uber in 2013. A driver ran into a 6-year-old girl, killed her, injured her mother and brother. The case went to trial. And when it went to trial, Uber said, well, guess what? You know what? That guy who was driving, he wasn't an Uber driver at the time of the accident. And you know why? Because he didn't have an Uber passenger in his car, and he hadn't yet accepted his next ride. So if you're trying to understand motives, what has just happened is Uber has thrown this driver onto the bus, refused to acknowledge any responsibility for the people who were harmed, and really is just out to protect its own interests. The next thing that matters is whether a company is fair, whether it uses fair means to achieve its goals. And so in 1 year, Uber asked its drivers to book and then cancel 5,000 rides on Lyft. Now, the name of the game in ride hailing is showing up on time. And so if you're willing to ask your employees on your behalf to disrupt the operations of your competitor, that's not fair. And so this is a question that also has people kind of going, gosh, I don't love how these guys do business. I don't like the way that they treat the people who they do business with. And the last thing is impact. And here, this is a story about a woman who wrote a blog post. So she was a reliability engineer at Uber. She wrote a blog post in 2017 and talked about how awful it was to be a female engineer at Uber and how sexist the environment was. So when she started, women were 25% of the engineers in her division. When she left, women were 6%. Now, Uber didn't intend for that to happen. That's not something where they set out to say, how can we make an environment which is really lousy for women to work in? But the impact of their actions was something that actually yielded this result. And so if any of you are thinking, well, that sounds pretty dodgy, but does it really matter? So here's what's happened since then. Uber started with 90% or more of the US ride-hailing market. It's now down to 2/3. And who owns the other third? It's Lyft. And how did Lyft get there? Just by not being Uber, right? And so if you want to cultivate long-term relationships with your customers and with your employees for that matter, being trusted is really an important thing. And Uber shows you what happens if you're not trusted over time.
And so what can a company like Uber do once they've lost trust? Is all hope lost?
So one of the great myths of trust, which you know, Shalene, which we found out, is that this notion that trust once lost can never be regained. That, it turns out, is just not true. Number one, that most companies, not entrepreneurial companies necessarily, are so well capitalized that even VW can withstand what happened to them in terms of the Dieselgate and come out the other side. But companies who are trying to recover from trust, there are like 3 processes that we found that are important. The first is you actually have to apologize. Now, this is not something that most of us signed up for when we became leaders. But in fact, the first stage of recovering trust is to say, I know what I did wrong. I'm very sorry I did this thing that was wrong. Here's an explanation for why it is that I did this thing. And here's my offer of repair. Here are the things I'm going to do in the future to try to not have this happen again. So if Boeing had done that, we'd feel way better about getting on a 737 MAX than we do right now. So the first stage is an apology. In the middle term, you actually have to deal with issues of who was responsible for what went on. So companies are hierarchies, and people reasonably expect someone to be held accountable if there's a problem. And in fact, Kalanick was actually finally let go by the board. And now there's another CEO in place at Uber. But they took so long to do that it was hard to give them much credit because so much damage had already been done. So stage 1, apologize. Stage 2, try to hold the right person accountable for what's gone on. And stage 3 is to try to fix the things that led to the problem in the first place. And here, we know that Uber has a number of things that they're trying to do to improve their service, to try to, bring people rides to COVID vaccinations. So they're trying to crawl back into some space that's more sustainable. And that fixing of the culture that led to these problems is the third stage. So it's apologize, hold someone accountable, and then fix the problem that caused it in the first place.
Thank you, Sandra. That was wonderful. And so thankfully, most companies aren't Uber and dealing with self-inflicted wounds. However, right now, because of the pandemic, there are a lot of companies that are in a space where they need to repair trust through no fault of their own. How should they go about doing that?
So, you raise a really good point. So, there are 2 big kinds of trust problems. One is a self-inflicted wound. Right. I did this to myself and I've got to find a way to fight back. The other is a trust problem that emerges from a shift in external forces. And so pandemic is like that. It's like a recession. None of you out there caused this pandemic in the same way that you wouldn't cause a recession, but you have to deal with the consequences of the actions that you take under the conditions of the recession, or in this case, the pandemic. And so I've been thinking and talking with Shalene, with you a lot about how it is that companies can move into, people talk about a post-pandemic world. I think that's not quite the right way to put it. I think we need to figure out how to manage in a world where pandemics are now part of our context on an ongoing basis. So this is not like, let's recover from this thing and then we'll be in a new environment. This is what kind of processes can we put in place to protect us and the people that we care about, given that pandemics will wax and wane. So my advice to you as entrepreneurs, if I were in your business, I'd ask you to ask 3 questions. I'd actually start with your employees, maybe depending on how many you have, and also with your customers, to find out how it is that you're doing right now with respect to your COVID response. The first question is, how has COVID been for you? Right, and that's just data gathering, because we really need to understand the texture of how this has worked in people's lives. The second question is, how have we done in managing COVID? Grade a scale of 1 to 5. What have we done well and what have we done not so well? And then the third question is, what's one challenge that you face going forward with respect to COVID and pandemics that we can help you with, that you'd like us to help us with? And if we ask those questions, we'd have much better data to work with to understand what's happening right now inside your businesses and what kind of a path you need to build going forward.
Besides the pandemic, it's also been a really politically eventful period, at least in America. We've seen companies take a stand on issues like Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, and voting rights, while others remain silent. But how should a company figure out when it's time to get political and when silence is actually the best course of action?
So why don't you let me cold call you and ask you, talk about your experience in researching Stop Asian Hate, because this is something that you did a lot of work in to try to figure out how it is that companies are responding, how people feel about their response.
Absolutely. So I did an article about companies' reactions to Stop Asian Hate. And what I did is I went and I surveyed employees about how they felt about their company's actions. And what I was surprised by was there was actually a divide by industry. So employees who worked for healthcare companies actually said that they expected their company to do something because their company was in a field where they had to reduce inequality and they had to work with people in society. However, employees at tech companies had lower expectations because they felt like they were dealing more with a product and less about social ills. And this isn't to say that all employees were happy when their employers did nothing, but rather that you need to figure out who your stakeholders are as a company, what your mission is, and figure out how that cause ties to it and how your stakeholders will perceive this. People were a lot less forgiving in the healthcare companies.
Yeah.
Oh, Sandra, anything to add to that?
I cut you off. So I was trying to apologize for that. No, I think that is actually the way to navigate this terrain. So there's one question, which is sort of, how big is this harm? Right. And that's just an absolute moral judgment that you make as a company about the nature of the issue. The second is, how close am I to that? Right. And so, as Shalene just said, healthcare, way closer to protecting employees, or so it feels if I'm an employee, with respect to Stop Asian Hate. And so this question about how close you are, it's really how close people perceive you to be to the issue and what expectation they have. And then the third is, what can you actually do? And here, I feel that companies have a lot more influence, at least within their span of control, over their customers and how they engage with them, and certainly with their employees. So, I don't know if many entrepreneurial businesses are going to stand up and say, I'm going to fight some legislation that has to do with restricting voting rights in my community. But it may be that if you have a platform and a business relates to that, it may very well be something that you want to consider. What we know from the people who do this is that you will get people on both sides coming at you. Some people will be really happy you spoke up, other people not so much. And so I think that's why the companies that tend to wade into these waters are bigger, and they tend to have more protections around them in terms of capital and all the other things. But it doesn't mean, some companies like Ben and Jerry's, Patagonia, they build their brands by taking a particular stance. And so I think that you shouldn't be afraid of it. It's more a question of how native is this to what you're trying to accomplish.
And so, Sandra, what's your biggest piece of advice to entrepreneurs who are looking to build trust?
I think that to me, the most important thing that I learned about trust is that it's actually pretty limited. Right. So we think about trust as this glue that holds us all together. We feel so great. It's not really like that. I trust Uber to take me in a car and take me downtown to my hairdresser. Right. And so that's all I'm asking Uber to do. So I'm not asking them to walk Winston, my dog, to make a meal for me. And so if I'm a business leader, if I'm an entrepreneur, what we're counting on you to do is to manage trust within the domains that matter. Right. And so that's the place to start. What are your critical processes? Which stakeholders really matter to you under what conditions? And one question that you can start asking kind of routinely is, will this decision, this action I'm about to take, win me trust or lose me trust, and with whom? Right. And so that's a way to kind of make this quite operational and pragmatic, and think about building it into just the normal questions that you are going to ask yourselves about decisions that you have to make anyway.
Thank you so much for that, Sandra. I'm going to move on to some of these pre-submitted questions that we got. First of all, our audience would like to know, what would you tell your younger self?
Oh, sorry, for some of us, that requires quite a lot of thinking back. I think I tell myself it's going to be okay. Right. I think when I was young, I was so worried about, will I be successful? Will I be able to accomplish any of the things that I think about? And it turns out that, that I think you can actually do quite a lot, but you don't know that when you're starting out. And so some of it is just to give yourself permission for how uncertain this is, but how basically, you're in charge of that. And you can make some of these things happen. So, I think I would have told the young Sandra, it's okay, don't fuss so much, and just go ahead and do the things that you think you want to do, and let's kind of see what happens.
Current day Shalene needed to hear that too, so thank you, because that was fun. Next up, besides what we see on paper or LinkedIn, what other due diligence can I do before I offer the letter of employment to a key team member?
That's a great question. I think that most of you are probably skilled at the behavioral interview, and I have always found that asking people to tell you about situations that they've been in and how they've handled them is really a critical window into how it is that they do business routinely. And you can ask that twice. You can say, tell me a good story about, tell me a not so great story about. But the trick is to try to say, if this person were really working inside my organization, this is what I'd want to know. Right? It's just, how did they operate, when the chips are down and all that. So I would ask them to tell stories about things that they've done. And then you can sort of step back from that and generalize and sort of say, well, this might be at least some window into how the person operates.
I'm going to add a flip side to that, which is when Sandra was interviewing me for a job, she asked a question that I literally said, Sandra, I love you. I want to work for you, after she asked that. And it was, what can I do as a boss that will drive you completely nuts? And I loved it. No one had ever bothered to ask me that before. And there are, in fact, like a couple little things where Sandra's wonderful. She's agreed not to do them. And I am so happy to work for her because I can just be really honest about those things and then do the best work that I can do for her.
Yeah, and Shalene's being too kind. My reliability factor on those things that drive her crazy, I'd say I'm at maybe 70% on a good day. But nonetheless, being able to talk about that stuff, that's huge, right? Yeah.
Those open, honest conversations, so rare in business, but so important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we've got another question about, as a bootstrap startup, building trust is tough with a lack of cash flow. How do I go about it?
So I'm not sure, actually, I feel like there's a question behind that question. And the question behind that question is, what am I allowed to do if I'm not making that much money? Am I allowed to lie and to tell people I'm making more money than I am? Am I allowed to exaggerate? Or am I allowed to at least be optimistic about my prospects going forwards? And there's a spectrum there, from things that are outright untrue to being optimistic, which is part of your job as an entrepreneur about the opportunity that you see and where you feel you are on that. So I think it's a really important question to ask, because there is some line drawing that you're going to want to do. Part of this issue of fair means is, are you giving people enough good information to make a decision about whether you're going to be successful or even to do business with you? And so really being, optimistic and candid about how things are going and where you're headed, I think that will help you. But I can certainly understand, I think, the motivation behind the question. I hope I haven't insulted the person who asked the question by inferring that was the question you were actually getting at.
It struck me as a great answer.
Yeah.
And so there you go. And then, so we've got one in the chat, which goes, I understand what you're trying to say with your Uber example. However, I don't know your motivation for how you are representing Uber. Are you recommending a company apologize when they have nothing to apologize for, because the scenario can be framed poorly by an adversary?
So I'm so glad that you asked that. I actually saw that question in chat, and I thought that's a really thoughtful. I appreciate you who asked that question. So no, you're not going to apologize for things that you didn't do. Right. That actually, there's some research that would suggest that actually makes you appear to be less trustworthy, because people are going, well, why are you apologizing for something that you didn't do? That's like weird and doesn't help. What I am advocating is that there is a point of coming to acknowledge things that have been harms that you've created. And that's the case in which I think, in order to be trusted, you do have to make some notion that people understand that you've created a harm, that you recognize it, and that you're sorry for that. Because if you don't do that, then someone says, well, you don't live in the same universe I do. If you can't see that was a harm, it's hard for me to understand how to trust you going forward, because you and I see things too differently. So please don't, this is not like a blanket go out and start apologizing to everyone. It's more in the event that something has gone wrong, it's created harm and an effect on some stakeholder that matters to you. That's the time where you're going to want to try to rebuild trust by, among other things, apologizing and, in trying to make good on that. So I'll just add one other gloss on that. So there are like better and worse ways to apologize. So one of the things that Shalene and I were kind of slightly hysterical about is that there's a whole academic literature on how it is that you would apologize. Who knew, right? And so it turns out that the three things that a good apology has, the first is just an acknowledgement of the harm and the fact that you're sorry about it. So that's how you start. The second is an explanation about what it is that led to that. And so that's not a defensive, let me tell that's as I understood this situation, here's what it was that seemed to cause it from our end. And the third is an offer of repair. And a lot of times what people are looking for at that point is just, okay, you got it, you acknowledged harm, you gave me an explanation, what are you going to do about that? And so that's a complete apology, is it has those three elements. And when the researchers tested it against three other elements, this was actually the most powerful kind of an apology when you do those three things.
Got it. Things to keep in mind for the next apology.
Okay.
So somebody wants to know, how would you suggest an early stage startup build trust with users and customers? I recently founded a startup to help people increase success and happiness by developing skills such as communication and emotional intelligence.
So one of the things, and I don't know if this is true of you, I'll just say that as I've worked with, in particular, Harvard Business School students who are entrepreneurs and starting their businesses, one of the hardest things for them to do is to actually talk with their customers. So it's very easy to default to surveying, to issues that are kind of looking in general. And I know from my own experience in business and building innovation in various kinds of businesses that you actually have to have some conversations about how this goes. Now, so I don't know how much you're currently in touch with your customers. If you say, well, that's not so helpful, Sandra, because I talk to them all the time, then I'd kind of dig into the question of, well, exactly what are you trying to find out in those conversations? Right. And how clear are you on the things that they could tell you that you need to know from them? Because specificity around that, you start broad and then you keep narrowing down to what's the thing I'm really trying to figure out. But I think the big rule here is if you want to learn more from customers, talk to them. And find out, what their experience has been kind of moment by moment as they engage with your business. It sounds like you're starting a great business that people would have a need for. So getting close to them, I think, would be great.
And from the same person, how would you suggest building trust with team members that have never met in person?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think that what we know matters in people trusting each other is if trust is vulnerability, there has to be some way in which people allow themselves to be vulnerable with each other. And that's easier to do in person than it is on Zoom. But there does have to be some element. And by the way, this is something where the leader has to demonstrate this. Right. So my specific advice is to start the next meeting by telling a story about something that happened to you that reveals some vulnerability and where you want to sort of create a safe space where people goes, well, hell, if she's willing to say that, I can share things as well. And so I think that trying to create an environment in which people are comfortable as they can be saying things on Zoom as they would be if they were in person. I think that's sort of the high art. One of the things, for what it's worth, that I've learned on Zoom in particular is that if I keep the camera in speaker mode, I'm able to see the person's face large and, and not focus as much on my face. And that was a trick that a colleague told me. And so it makes actually those engagements with people far more intimate because actually you're seeing and talking with them in a very direct way. Those are two things that I can think of. I don't know if that's helpful. It's just what occurs to me.
I'll add that Sandra and I have had some of our most vulnerable conversations on Zoom, so she really means this.
Yeah, it's definitely true. Yeah, yeah.
And so here's the scenario someone would like advice on. If a business partner has become untrustworthy and behavior becomes aggressive due to frustration with delays, etc., is it worth trying to repair the relationship? Can a leopard change its spots? Or do we need to figure out an exit and move on?
I think that the judgment call there is a couple of things. One is, how valuable is the person to your business? Right. So if that person has skills that nobody else has, that you still need, you're going to need to back up some plan that says, to replace those skills, I need to do X. And I need to bring someone else to do that. So that's the first question. The second is, how troubling is this behavior? Right. There's a range of, I gave you a wrong answer once, to this is a pattern where I'm not telling you the truth, where I'm not disclosing things. Obviously, if it's a one-off, it's useful to find that out because people are not perfect. And so sometimes people actually don't behave as well as they'd like to, and they can be called out on that. If it's a pattern of behavior that you see over time, I think that's a point to start saying, okay, this looks like this leopard can't change its spots, and I'm going to need to find a new leopard. And I think that that's just a whole separate process about how you sever the relationship with that individual. But it's definitely a question of, is this a pattern or a one-off, and how can you verify that your judgment at the moment isn't just based on 2 bad weeks in someone's life. I was just on a call with someone earlier today, and I asked him how he was. He told me that his son who is 6 years old, had contracted COVID. Now, if he hadn't said that, I would never know that that was what was going on in his mind. But if he behaved a little weirdly during that encounter, my God, I gave him lots of room for that to occur. So sometimes we don't know what's going on in people's lives. And I have definitely parted company with people who I feel are not useful to the cause. So I'm not saying, put up with people no matter what. It's more just making sure sort of what's the basis on which you're making this evaluation.
100%. Moving on to competition. So while trying to disrupt an industry, how do you compete without comparing yourselves to your competitors?
Hmm. So, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to this question. I will make something up, and it's either going to make sense or not, because I'm thinking, Shalene, of this company that we studied, Recruit Holdings in Japan. And so this is a platform matching business. And they have the equivalent of a marketplace for automobiles, for education, for getting married, for ordering dinner, and for getting your nails done. And the only way that they can communicate sort of what nature of the business they're in is to put in a chart, here's this line of business, and here's who normally does this as a business unto itself. Right. And so this is like combining this business and this business and this business. And quite honestly, if I hadn't seen that chart, I wouldn't know how to evaluate how different they were. So I think there is some element of needing to help people understand what is the comparison. And in particular, if you're disrupting, on what basis are you a disruptor? Right. So what's the specific way that you're disrupting? And I think that's where you can differentiate, but there are probably ways in which you're also the same as your competitors. Right. And so I think that that's important, but I don't know if that's a useful comment or not, because I'm kind of making that up right now.
If you have follow-ups, definitely feel free to submit in the Q&A. So
Yeah,
we can
definitely.
the two-way conversation. So speaking of going and buying leopards at the leopard shop, how would you find a technical team or a co-founder, particularly a CTO?
Oh, well, this is probably something you've already done, but I'd look at everybody else's business and kind of see who works for them. And I don't mean, by the way, to go buy that leopard. I then would then start asking, who does that person know? Right. So if that person's really good at it, they probably have a network of other people. And so you have to ask permission of the company. Is it okay for you to have a conversation with this person? Because you're not trying to poach them. But I think that, people in a given domain tend to know each other. And you have your own impressions of who's good at this stuff and who's not, and also who may be available and who's not. So I think you sort of start some minor networking through the companies where you think this job is doing well.
There we go. And that's how you find a leopard at the leopard shop. I'm in love with that phrase. I'm just going to keep using it all day. More specifically, with regards to subscription businesses, how would you go about retaining customers?
So that's a question of how to make sure that you know what they're thinking, right? So if you're a subscription business, once I give you my money, there tends to be a kind of a studied indifference to my experience of the business over time. And so I think that anybody who is kind of logging onto you in that sense, if you care about retaining them, you're going to want to have more customer inquiry than you might think is necessary, given the business model that you're in order to try to understand what's working for people and what's not. And those are like individual conversations, that you would have with X number of people on a weekly or monthly basis, just to have your finger on the pulse of what it is that they're thinking. Because I think that you can't just imagine what's going on in their minds. You actually have to ask.
And just to echo Sandra, because I spent a very brief amount of my time working with subscription businesses. So first of all, it's a recurring product or service. So you have to make sure that there's a consistent flow of quality and that you're consistently meeting the customer's need, as she said. So keep checking in that there's no break in the quality or how you're meeting something. And then secondly, with regard to conversions and subscription renewal, you've got to make sure that it's the right price aimed at the right customer at the right time. And we're seeing more and more personalization of pricing. But there is a way in which, different people have their different price points. And something that's surprising is it's not necessarily a cheaper price point that will get you the customer. Sometimes they place more value in something that's priced a little higher. And brief period in my life where I looked at a ton of data about this.
Wow.
So moving on, what if trust is compromised in a partnership? In your experience, what are the key red flags to identify before considering ending the relationship, position, or even venture?
Mhm. Well, you know, I would recommend actually parsing the concerns that you're having through this framework of, is this a question of competence? Is it motives? Is it whether the person uses fair or unfair means and how they go about doing business? And what's the actual impact of their behavior inside the company? And the reason why Shalene and I built this framework up from studying companies and leaders who do a good or bad job with trust was to try to make it operational. So we tried to build something that actually were questions that you could ask to interrogate a problem. And so this is a great example of giving yourself 4 different slices at trying to understand what's the nature of this relationship and where is it not working. And the more of those things where you're kind of not good there, not good there, not good there, it just will build more confidence in your judgment about what to do. So I don't think you're asking us to, say, how should you go about doing that? It's more on what basis would you make the call?
And then we've got a follow-up to an earlier question. So the earlier question was, how do you suggest an early stage startup build trust with users and customers? There was a clarification, which was, thank you very much for your answer. Good point on vulnerability. My first question is actually about how to convert website visitors into users/customers, or convert users/customers into return customers, assuming we need to build trust with them first.
I think we are rapidly getting to my point of not being able to be useful. So I want to be sort of clear about what I know and what I don't know. So I think this question about how you can convert customers at different stages along the path of doing business with you, what I know from my own experience in business and the businesses I've studied is that the principle of being close to the customer at the points of interaction and the times of interaction is what gives you the information that you need. And so usually if you're asking a question about how should this happen, I'd start again by going back into the customers and finding some way to start getting some data for yourself on the moments in which they are doing business with you at these different stages and trying to understand what factors they're taking into account as they're making a decision about whether or not they do business with you. And so the people who decide to kind of come back again, that would be a group I would go back to and try to understand, well, why did they make that decision? What was it that they were thinking about as they were doing that? And all the way along the path, if there was some way to go back to some of the people who didn't sign up again and just trying to figure out, well, why not? What was going on there, kind of like an exit interview for customers. So I feel like it's hard to imagine those things. I think the only way you can do it is to start getting a healthy dose of some information that you can then start to make decisions around.
I'm also going to add big data as your friend here and A/B listening. I'm just figuring out what are the different scenarios, what are people with the same characteristics behaving like, what do they do in the different situations, depending on if you change one parameter or another.
Great point. Yeah.
More flood. Let's see. Some good ones. Are businesses which embrace transparency more trusted?
I would say in general, yes. I have a colleague who does really interesting research on what he calls operational transparency. And what he's found in his research, is a professor named Brian Buell, is that if you reveal, for example, some of the work that goes into the product, in particular the service that a customer sees, they actually have more appreciation for that service than if there was a black box. And so that's it. And he calls this operational transparency because it's literally like trying to put a camera over the shoulder of the company as it's doing its work and trying to show all the work that goes into it. And if you're building good processes to make things happen, that would strengthen the cause. and people's ability to understand what it is, what's under the hood. So I think that kind of transparency is useful. And I don't know kind of where the limit is to that. I would imagine that there is some limit around transparency, but I'd have to think more about the question myself before I'd give an answer.
Another question. If we're an impact-driven company that wants to ensure the quality standards are being upheld by vendors that we work with, that usually requires asking a series of questions, that can come off as distrust. How do you do this right? Sandra, this makes me think about Patagonia, if that
Yeah,
didn't
go for it. Yeah. Why don't you want to talk about that? Yeah.
Sure. So we did some research on Patagonia, which prides itself in having a very robust supplier network and having an extremely rigorous line of values that they adhere to, whether it's environmental or how their goods are being produced. And so they were auditing their first line suppliers and realized there were some issues. And they decided, you know what, we're going to go even deeper into our supply chain. And they looked at their raw material suppliers. And they were horrified to discover that actually there was indentured labor being used, and that they were hiring, the raw material factories were hiring employees by using a headhunter that charged exorbitant fees, and then the employees couldn't pay them off. So they were basically trapped. And Patagonia said, this is basically not acceptable. And they worked together with the governments of the countries they were in to put a stop to this. They went through a rigorous process of auditing their first level suppliers, and they actually tried to start a consortium in the retail business to ensure that other companies went through the same process. And it was actually kind of disheartening because other retailers said, no, we're not going to do this. So it was only Patagonia, but I would say that there's more trust in Patagonia. That certainly converted me into a consumer and a customer of Patagonia, because you know that they're doing the due diligence. And sometimes you have to do the due diligence and ask the questions. Otherwise, you don't know what's going on.
Right. And I think that for Patagonia, as it probably would be for your business, this was a compliment to external people whose job it was to go there and to do their due diligence and to look at whether or not their standards were being complied with. And the reason why Patagonia went this route is that they were just starting to get some feedback that said that they think that those, as good as those reports were, they got interested in whether or not they were learning the whole story. So that's why they went in themselves to start to audit, first at the top level, and then, as Shalene just described, at the next level down. And so I think, very good people are in the business of trying to figure these things out on your behalf. But there may very well be times when you're going to want to double up on that if you really care about it, and see, is there something you can find out if you were the ones that asked the question? It's going to be harder because people are less likely to be candid with you than they might be with a third party. But I think that given, good intent and a way of sort of dealing with people on a human basis, you may be able to find some things you wouldn't know otherwise.
So another question, trust obviously builds confidence. Has this changed the way that you view opportunities? Do you find yourself saying yes or engaging more with opportunities more quickly?
I think that that's a very good connection. It's definitely true that if you step into this area, you start to get a feel for how your relationships work. And what allows those relationships to be more successful, and how to build trust within them. And that does give you more confidence to kind of step off the path with some other people and say, okay, let's see if we can do this thing. Right, because there's definitely an aspect to trust, which is it allows things to happen that literally couldn't happen if trust weren't in the room. So, if you go back to the dawn of time and think about Facebook, think about Uber, all of these were bets on trust. And so I think that this notion that trust allows you to do things that you couldn't do otherwise, I think is a really good way to think about it.
And just to wrap up with one final question. Based on your experience while studying business, what are your top pieces of advice for success?
Oh, God. So, I think that I'm a big believer in self-cultivation. So, I think that personal success is built on treating yourself as a project that can be improved all the time. and that this is something where it's not like you reach a certain age and it's done, and being quite mindful about what it is that you're working on at any given stage in your career is really helpful. So, for this period of time, this next 6 months, here are the things I'm working on for myself to get better at. And I think that having some kind of a program for self-development and self-cultivation actually builds your skills over time in a way that if you kind of assume that that's going on, but don't treat it quite as seriously, you're kind of counting on something that may or may not be happening. So I would definitely sort of look to some notion of what it is that you think you need to improve at various stages, and build up a plan for how you're going to do that, how you're going to know if you're going to make progress on that. And I think we are much more capable of being developed than we think we are, if we take this more mindful approach.
Thank you so much for that, Sandra. And thank you all for coming to this event. It's been such a pleasure to share the fruits of our hard work. This has been many years in the making. And as well as, if you didn't get a chance to ask a question, please feel free to reach out to us. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, and there's a form on our website where you can submit questions and we'd love to answer them.
Amazing, Sandra, Shalene, thank you so much. It's very clear that you guys have done a ton of research on trust and how it's not just a tagline on a website. So really appreciate you guys sharing your wisdom, expertise, insights, and research with our community today. Hopefully they can go on, create more trusting relationships, and to be honest, do better business. Right. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone on our team and everyone in attendance today. We really appreciate you guys. And if you haven't already, check out their website, thepoweroftrustbook.com. For more, if you didn't get your question answered, you can fill out a form on there too. Teresa, the recording will be available later on YouTube, so we'll also send that in follow-up email. But Sandra, Shalene, thank you so much. It's been great to learn from you guys, and we really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You guys ask great questions, right? Around 5 minutes up, I'm going, another question. So you are a great audience in that regard. So thanks so much for your engagement. I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Totally agreed. All right. Well, for those of you still on, we'd love for you to join us on our upcoming webinars. Tomorrow morning, we've got a How to Find Your Genius with Kelly Track. And next Tuesday, we have Navigating Startup Law with Becky DeGraw. So we hope you can attend those if those are of interest. And we look forward to seeing you all online soon. Have a good one.